The body hit the stone floor at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Mara Voss stood over it with split knuckles, a gash along her jaw she hadn't felt yet, and the sinking realization that she had made a catastrophic mistake, not the killing that had been necessary. The mistake was walking through Ironwood territory in the first place. She had taken the eastern pass because the main road was washed out, and she had a delivery to make by dawn. A sealed letter between two packs who didn't want anyone knowing they were communicating. Courier work. Quiet, anonymous, done in a night. She had done it 100 times across a dozen territories without incident. But Dirk Cole had been patrolling that night. And Dirk Cole had a reputation for seeing a lone wolf on his land and deciding, on principle, that such a thing required correction. He had cornered her in the passage with 2 of his wolves. He had told her she was trespassing. She had agreed, apologized, and offered to leave immediately. He had told her the toll for trespassing was a pound of flesh, not metaphorically, and when she had laughed, because sometimes the body did things without permission, he had shifted and lunged. What followed was 30 seconds of pure survival instinct that Mara would spend a considerable amount of time afterward trying not to think about too carefully. Now Dirk Cole was on the floor of his own great hall, having made the fatal error of dragging her inside to make an example of her in front of his pack. And 47 wolves were staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked, unsettlingly, like relief. The silence was enormous. Elder Rowan stepped forward from the gathered crowd. He was old, weathered, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by the world sometime around its 40th year. He looked at Dirk. He looked at Mara. He looked at Dirk again. "You killed the alpha," he said. "He started it," Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He challenged you for trespassing on pack territory. I told him I'd leave. He escalated. You broke his spine." Mara looked down at Dirk Cole's very still body and thought about the words "I was just passing through" and whether they could still technically apply to her situation. She decided probably not. "He was going to kill me," she said. "Every wolf in this room knows it. You've all seen him do it before." The crowd shifted. Feet moving. Eyes dropping. No one disagreed. Rowan's expression didn't change. "It doesn't matter why," he said. "It matters what the law says. You killed the alpha in direct challenge. On pack ground. In front of witnesses." He paused. "The crown passes to you." Mara stared at him. "I don't want it." "That," said Elder Rowan, with the weary tone of a man who had long since made peace with the universe's indifference to personal preferences, "has never been a requirement." She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the alpha's chair, Dirk's chair. A massive carved thing that made her feel like a child playing dress up, and went through his papers and tried to understand Had she'd inherited, it was worse than she'd expected, and she had expected something fairly bad. The eastern border was contested. Had been for years, apparently, with the Ashwood pack pushing incrementally, testing Dirk's responses, finding them inconsistent. The pack finances were functional but strained. There were 3 ongoing disputes among pack members that had gone unresolved for so long they'd calcified into permanent resentments. The southern relationship with Greyclaw was held together by an informal agreement Dirk had apparently made verbally and never written down. And there were 47 wolves who needed an alpha. Soren found her there at 3 in the morning. He was her age, built with the kind of quiet solidity that suggested the world had thrown things at him and he had simply absorbed them. He'd been Dirk's second in command, which Mara had initially assumed meant he was compromised, but he'd been the first wolf to step forward in the hall and stand beside her, and he had the eyes of someone who'd been waiting for a change. He made tea. He sat across from her. He laid out the situation in plain language without drama or editorial. "You could run," he said when he was finished, "I know. Pack falls to war inside a week if the title stays empty. Dark had challengers waiting. 3 of them. They've been circling for months. I know. There are 11 wolves in this pack under the age of 16. Mara pressed her palms flat on the table. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the hall smelled like pine resin and old stone and something that might have been home if she was the kind of person who believed in such things. 2 months, she said. I hold the line for 2 months. I stabilize things. I find someone qualified for the title, and then I'm gone. Soren wrapped his hands around his mug and said nothing. What? Mara said. Nothing? Soren said. 2 months. Sure. She didn't like the way he said it. The first 3 weeks were a controlled disaster. Mara learned the pack by necessity. Their names, their histories, their grievances, their particular ways of testing a new alpha to see what she was made of. She broke up to fights, mediated one property dispute that had allegedly been ongoing since before she was born, and sat through 4 separate lectures from Elder Rowan about the proper ceremonial protocols for territorial declarations, none of which she intended to follow but all of which she listened to respectfully because Rowan's cooperation was valuable and his opposition would be expensive. She slept in Dirk's room, which she'd stripped down to bare walls and plain furniture, because the room itself was well positioned and had good sight lines to the main gate, and she was a practical person. And she ate with the pack. She learned which of the wolves under 16 were the ones to watch, the quick ones, the angry ones, the quietly brilliant ones, and she started paying particular attention to a 16-year-old named Lily who had more tactical instinct in her left hand than most fully grown wolves had in their entire bodies. She was just beginning to feel like she had a loose grip on the situation when the eastern border produced a new problem. She'd been expecting the Ashwood pack. Soren had warned her. Their alpha, Caden Holt, had been circling Ironwood territory for months before Dirk died, testing the edges with small strategic moves. A patrol that went slightly past the marker. A trade negotiation that proposed terms slightly more favorable than anything Dirk would accept. A steady low-pressure push designed to create just enough instability that an opportunity would eventually present itself. She was at the eastern markers when they came. The morning was sharp and cold, mist moving through the pine trees in slow horizontal sheets, and she felt them before she heard them. That particular shift in the air that happened when a large predator entered territory that wasn't theirs. 4 of them stepped out of the tree line. The man at the front walked the way some people walked, like the ground had agreed in advance to cooperate. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a jacket that cost more than the fence posts along Mara's western boundary, and he had the face of someone who had learned early that other people tended to make decisions in his favor if he simply looked at them long enough and said nothing. He stopped at the border line. His eyes found her immediately, and they stayed there with an attention that she recognized from long experience as the kind that was doing arithmetic. Alpha Voss, he said. You're on my border, Holt, she said. He glanced at his feet. He was 2 inches inside the marker, which was probably deliberate. He stepped back exactly 1 pace. I came to offer condolences about the situation, he said. Taking on a pack you didn't choose. That's a wait. You didn't come here to discuss my feelings. Something moved through his expression, not quite amusement, not quite respect. The kind of look a chess player got when an opponent opened with an unexpected gambit. No, he said. I came to discuss a border renegotiation. The Ridge territory has been disputed for 2 decades. I think it's time to settle it formally. No, Mara said. He blinked. Very slightly. You haven't heard my terms. Your terms will be structured to give Ashwood something valuable while offering me something that sounds valuable but isn't, she said. And the actual purpose is to establish that Ironwood is open to negotiation 3 weeks into a new leadership, which will signal to every pack watching that Ironwood can be moved. So my answer is no. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one in the hall after Dirk died. This one had texture to it. You're more strategic than I expected, Caden said. You're more obvious than I expected, Mara said, and turned around and walked back toward the hall with Soren at her shoulder, and did not look back. And absolutely did not think about the expression on his face when she'd cut off his opening. Before he'd finished making it, she thought about it later. She shouldn't have, but she did. His formal meeting request arrived 4 days later. A sealed letter, Ashwood's mark on the wax. 3 significant concessions on northern trade routes in exchange for a discussion of the Ridge territory. The concessions were worth considerably less than the Ridge access would give him, which meant he wasn't actually interested in the trade. Which meant he was interested in something else. Mara wrote back and invited him to Ironwood Hall. If he wanted to negotiate, he would do it on her ground, in her hall, and she would know what it looked like when he didn't have home advantage. He came with 2 wolves, no ceremony, and the same jacket. He walked into her hall the way he'd stood at her border, like the room had agreed in advance, and then he saw her sitting at the long table with her papers and her coffee, and she watched him recalibrate, very slightly in real time. She had not dressed for the meeting. She had not rearranged the hall. She had not done anything except make good coffee and sit at the table and wait. Some people would have read that as weakness. Caden Holt read it the way she'd intended, as someone who didn't need the staging. He sat across from her. She pushed the coffee toward him. He poured himself a cup, and she watched his hands while he did it, because how a person handled small things in a foreign space told you quite a lot. She had the real numbers on the Ridge by the 2nd week. Her own survey, independent assessment, resource valuation. She slid it across the table to him and watched his face when he understood that she'd already done the math. You want to redraw the line here, she said, pointing, which gives Ashwood direct access to the underground spring system feeding the Eastern Valley, which is worth approximately 4 times the northern trade concessions. She closed her folder. So let's skip the part where we pretend this is about geography. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've been alpha for 4 weeks. And he said it the way someone said something when what they meant was something else entirely. 3.5, she said. I catch up fast. They worked for 2 hours after that, and they found a solution, new treaty language formalizing the existing boundary, legal clarity for both packs, no ground lost on either side. It was a better outcome than his original proposal by every measure. She watched him recognize that. She watched him not be bothered by it, which was itself information. When the meeting ended and he stood to leave, he paused at the door. Same time next week, he said. There are still clauses to finalize. Send me the proposed language and I'll review it, she said. He nodded. He left. Soren materialized at her shoulder 30 seconds later. That went well, he said. It went as expected, Mara said. He's coming back, Soren said. I know, Mara said. He came back. He came back the following week for the clause finalization. He came back the week after for what he described as a social integration protocol review, which turned out to be a formal dinner with her 3 senior wolves that lasted for hours and involved more laughter than Mara had heard in the hall since she'd arrived. He came back 2 weeks after that for a walking survey of the treaty boundary, which required precisely none of the 6 hours they spent walking the eastern ridge in the long autumn light, talking about everything except territory. Each time there was a legitimate reason. Each time the legitimate reason ran out well before the visit did. Mara was not unaware of what was happening. She was, in fact, acutely aware of it in the way one was acutely aware of a splinter, a persistent, specific pressure that drew attention no matter what else you were doing. The problem was she kept agreeing to the meetings. She told herself it was political. Ashwood was their most significant neighboring pack. Maintaining a strong working relationship with Hold was strategically sound. The treaty was genuinely important. These were all true things. They were not the only true things. During the boundary walk, with their respective seconds trailing diplomatically far behind, he told her about his first year as Alpha. The mistakes, the overcorrections, the specific humiliation of making a significant territorial decision with absolute confidence and having it unravel 3 months later in a way that was entirely predictable in retrospect. He told it without self-pity, with the dry precision of someone who had integrated the lesson and moved past the wound. She told him about the pack, about the twins and the fence post shed, which she had finally understood when she found a letter from their father in the back of the disputed shed, the last one he'd ever written, addressed to both of them. About Lily, the 16-year-old with the tactical instincts, who was failing every formal assessment because the assessments were designed to test memory and compliance rather than the thing Lily actually had, which was a rare and precise ability to understand what someone wanted before they'd finished wanting it. "You're not describing a pack you plan to leave," Caden said. They were standing at the third disputed boundary marker, the late afternoon light coming through the trees at a long golden angle that had nothing to do with property law. "I'm describing a pack that's taking up more of my brain than expected," Mara said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not." He looked at her. She looked at the marker. The air between them had the specific density of something unspoken that both parties were aware of and neither had yet decided to address. She addressed it the following week in her office late on a Tuesday evening, when he arrived without a meeting request for the first time and handed her a formal Greyclaw territorial claim that she hadn't heard about yet, which he had already countered on her behalf with Ashwood's formal backing. Without being asked, without any treaty obligation requiring him to do so, she stood in the doorway reading the Greyclaw notice and understood, in the particular way that understanding sometimes arrived, not as a thought but as a physical sensation. A settling that this man had deliberately protected her flank and told 3 other packs that Ironwood's territorial integrity was Ashwood's concern. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he said. "The treaty doesn't require Mara." He said her name the way it was meant to be said, without the title, without the politics. "I did it because I wanted to. That's all." She looked up at him. He was standing in her doorway without a plan, without an angle, without anything except honesty arranged plainly on his face. "What are you doing?" she asked. Because she wanted to hear him say it. He told her. All of it. The original calculation, the border opportunity, the assumption that Dirk's replacement would be manageable. The moment in the first meeting when she'd taken his strategy apart in 15 minutes and then offered him a better solution and coffee. The way he'd found himself, driving back to Ashwood that first evening, recounting the conversation in his head with the specific helpless quality of a man who had sat down to play a game and realized he was no longer playing. "I've been finding reasons to come back since the second meeting," he said. "And you know that. And you've been letting me. And I think we should talk about what that means." Mara was quiet for a long time. She folded the Greyclaw notice into precise thirds. Outside, the pack hall was winding down for the evening. She could hear Soren's voice somewhere, steady and low, and the sound of the younger wolves in the yard. "I didn't want this pack," she said finally. "I know. I came here by accident and I stayed out of obligation and I kept telling myself I was leaving as soon as things stabilized." She paused. "Things have been stable for 3 weeks. I'm still here." He waited. He was good at waiting. He'd learned it somewhere along the way. The understanding that some things could not be moved faster without breaking. "The elder thinks I'm going to leave," she said. "He's been asking around about succession protocol. He thinks I'm a temporary solution waiting to happen." "What do you think?" Caden asked. She thought about the twins and the letter in the shed. She thought about Lily, who had come to her office 3 days ago not to ask for help but to present her with a complete strategic assessment of the eastern border dispute that was, in several respects, better than the ones Mara had commissioned from senior wolves. She thought about the way the hall smelled in the mornings now, familiar in a way she hadn't noticed accumulating. She thought about the man standing in her doorway, who had backed her flank, without being asked and driven to hours to deliver the news in person, when he could have sent a letter. "I'm staying," she said. And the words, once out, had the particular quality of things that had been true for a while and were simply being acknowledged for the first time. "I'm staying. I'm deciding that right now." Something opened in his face. Not the composed alpha, not the strategic negotiator. Just him, behind all the architecture of power and patience. "And the other thing," she said. "The non-diplomatic thing. I'm open to negotiating terms." "What are your opening conditions?" he asked, and there was a warmth in his voice that had nothing to do with treaties. "You stop pretending the treaty needs another meeting done. And the next time you come to my gate," she said, "you come because you want to. Not because you found a clause to revisit." "And you'll let me in?" he asked. The words were light, but the question underneath them was not. "You backed my flank against Greyclaw when you had no political reason to," Mara said. "You're already inside. Hold, we're just catching up to it." He left that night with the Greyclaw situation handled and the last of the treaty language agreed upon, and nothing left between them that was unspoken. The old man was quiet for a moment, and then something shifted in the deep lines of his face. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. "Good," he said. 3 weeks later, the treaty was formally ratified at a joint signing in Ironwood Hall. Both packs witnessed it. The boundary was settled. The northern trade routes were formalized. The legal language that Mara had spent 3 months refining was signed into pack record in front of everyone who needed to see it. After the witnesses left and the formal part of the evening gave way to the informal part, food, noise, to packs in one hall who were finding, tentatively, that they could occupy the same space without their hackles up, Caden found Mara on the hall steps, looking out at the yard. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. "I don't have another treaty to negotiate." "I know," he stood beside her. The night was cold and clear, the kind of autumn night that smelled like frost and pine and the particular sharpness of a season changing its mind. Through the hall windows came light and sound, the warm noise of a pack that was, incrementally, becoming itself. "Come back Thursday," she said. "No treaty to discuss," he said. "I know. No formal reason." "I know that too." She glanced at him sideways. "Come anyway." He looked at her in the dark, in the way that she had learned to read over the past 3 months as his version of honesty. "Stripped of all the strategy, Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. She went back inside. He stood on the steps for another moment, in the cold and the dark and the pine-scented air, and he smiled with no one watching, which was the best kind. The crown had come to her sideways, by accident, at the cost of split knuckles and a scar along her jaw that had healed slightly crooked and that she'd stopped noticing sometime around the 6th week. She hadn't wanted it. She'd said so clearly and repeatedly and to anyone who would listen. But wanting and keeping were different questions, it turned out, and she had learned. In the slow way that real things were learned, through accumulated Tuesday evenings and arguments about treaty uses and a 16-year-old's unexpected strategic mind and 47 wolves who needed someone to stay, that she was in fact a keeper. The crown stayed, so did she.